May 29th, 2011, Florence, Kentucky. After missing their morning church service, 74-year-old Bill Stephenson and his 74-year-old wife Peggy Stephenson are found murdered inside their condo. Their causes of death are listed as blunt force trauma and sharp force trauma, and while few details about the crime scene are released to the public, it's reported that the victims' bodies and a number of items in the condo were moved around and staged in a specific fashion in order to send some sort of message. It's believed that the killer remained at the scene for hours after committing the murders, and an unidentified DNA profile is found there, but it is never matched to anyone, and the crime remains unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and this week, we're going to be exploring a pair of cold cases involving elderly married couples, the 2011 murders of Bill and Peggy Stephenson, and the 2011 murder of Bill Wood and the disappearance of his wife, Kay Wood. These crimes took place in different states within only 2 months of each other, and while there does not appear to be any connection between the two cases, the one thing they have in common is that they are both major head-scratchers. You might recall that The Trail Went Cold started off the year with an episode about the 2014 murders of another elderly married couple named Russell and Shirley Dermond, which was once featured on the Unsolved Mysteries podcast. Well, the murders of Bill and Peggy Stephenson were also featured on that podcast, and what's particularly odd is that both the Dermonds and Stephensons seem to be universally beloved people who had close relationships with their families and no known enemies, so no one has been able to come up with a potential motive for why they were brutally murdered inside their own home. The murders of the Stephensons could best be described as one of the most cryptic crimes I've explored in quite some time, as law enforcement has claimed that the killer or killers likely spent several hours inside the couple's condo moving the victims' bodies and many other items around in order to stage the scene in a specific fashion. But since they have publicly withheld all the specific details about how exactly this scene was staged, we can only speculate about what they mean. Now, the circumstances of the Bill and Kay Wood case are quite different, but no less bizarre, as it involves someone burning down the couple's home in rural Iowa before Bill's charred body was found in the rubble, as he had been shot multiple times. However, Kay's body was nowhere to be found, and the couple's pickup truck would be discovered 170 miles away in the parking lot of an apartment complex in Kansas City, Missouri. As far as anyone could tell, the Woods had no ties to the area, and while witnesses reported seeing a middle-aged man in the vicinity of the abandoned truck, he has never been identified. Once again, the Woods were described as incredibly nice, universally beloved people with no known enemies, so no one could figure out the motive for this crime, and to this day, Kay is still a missing person. So on this episode, I'll start off by sharing the details of the Stephenson case before I provide my theories and analysis, and then I'll do the same thing with the Wood case. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has over 90 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by exploring the murders of Bill and Peggy Stephenson. Our first story begins in 2011 in the town of Florence, Kentucky, which is located in Boone County near the Ohio state line and is part of the Cincinnati metropolitan area and had a population of just under 30,000 at that time. Our two victims are 74-year-old William Lee Stephenson, who goes by the name Bill, and his 74-year-old wife, Peggy Stephenson. Bill is the oldest of 14 siblings in his family, and he and Peggy were high school sweethearts who are just 3 months shy of their 55-year wedding anniversary. The couple have 2 sons and a daughter, as well as 7 grandchildren and 1 great-granddaughter, and they are both members of the Union Baptist Church, where Bill serves as a deacon and Peggy is the organist. After retiring from his job at an insurance investment company in 2008, Bill started doing missionary work and would deliver food and clothing to the needy throughout eastern Kentucky. His biggest passion project was when he converted a trailer located behind the Travel Centers of America truck stop on Burlington Pike into a ministry called the Truckers' Chapel. The chapel would be a location where long-haul truck drivers would gather and pray while they were traveling on the road, and Bill would serve as the chaplain minister. He held Sunday services for these truckers and offered them spiritual guidance, and even used a CB radio to spread the word and invite the truckers there. The chapel is located just under 4 miles east of the Stephensons' residence, as Bill and Peggy live on the first floor of a 5-unit condo complex on Ridge Edge Court in the Oakbrook neighborhood near the end of a large housing development. By all accounts, the couple are universally beloved by everyone they know, and no one has a bad word to say about them. Well, on the morning of Sunday, May the 29th, Bill and Peggy were scheduled to attend their weekly 9 a.m. services at the Union Baptist Church, but they never showed up. Their daughter, Beth Stephenson Victor, was present at the service, and during a phone conversation with her mother the previous day, Peggy told her that they were planning to be there as well. By the time the service ended, the Stephensons had still not shown up, and Bill also did not attend his scheduled Sunday service at the Truckers' Chapel, so Beth attempted to call her parents on their home phone and their cell phones. When they failed to answer multiple times, Beth became concerned enough to ask her husband, CJ Victor, to go check their condo. When CJ arrived, he noticed that the front door was ajar, and when he walked inside, he was shocked to discover that Bill and Peggy had been murdered, so he immediately contacted the Boone County Sheriff's Office. CJ also called Beth on her cell phone and told her to come to the condo immediately, and by the time she arrived, it had already been sealed off as a crime scene, and she was given the horrible news that her parents had been killed. Now, very few specific details about these murders and the crime scene have been released to the public, so I'll share what I can. Since day one, the lead investigator has been Detective Coy Cox of the Boone County Sheriff's Office, who went to high school with Beth and has known the Stephenson family for most of his life. Cox has done interviews with a number of media outlets and true crime podcasts, but has been very cautious about what to disclose. It's been reported that Bill and Peggy's causes of death were blunt force trauma and sharp force trauma, but while investigators think they know the instruments used to kill them, based on the injuries, that information has not been released, though it was confirmed that the murder weapons were not left behind at the scene. Each victim was found in a different room inside the condo, and while it wasn't disclosed which victim was found in what room, the bodies were deliberately posed in a certain fashion. Only one of the victims showed signs of struggle, while the other did not, and a post-mortem injury was inflicted on one of them nearly 2 hours after their death. Investigators were able to determine the exact time of death based on a medical device that was implanted in one of the victims, and while they haven't released it publicly, they have said that the murders took place sometime between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. on May the 29th. However, what really stood out to Detective Cox was the way that the scene was staged, as he told the media, quote, "The crime scene of all the crime scenes I've been on was the most unique by far," end quote. While no specific details were shared, it was reported that a number of items inside the condo were moved around and staged in a particular fashion, as Cox stated, quote, "There wasn't one room in that house that wasn't staged," end quote. Years later, Cox would be interviewed on an episode of the Unsolved Mysteries podcast about this case, and here's how he summarized the whole situation, quote, "I'm always reluctant to say the crime scene. We do not actually have a crime scene in this case, in this murder. We had the scene that our perpetrator or perpetrators wanted us to find. So we really didn't have the crime scene. We had a crime scene that was completely changed from its original condition at the time of the murders, end quote. Among the few details which have been released are that some of the more valuable items in the condo, including some cash, were left behind, even though they were visible and out in the open. It's also been reported that some photos were arranged to suggest that the killer liked certain people and disliked others. It's been estimated that the responsible party could have remained inside the condo for as long as 6 hours after committing the murders in order to stage the scene, and Cox described the whole situation by stating, quote, "I can tell that there is a message that someone was trying to tell us. However, that message is known only to them," end quote. One opinion that Detective Cox has never hesitated to share is his belief that Bill and Peggy were targeted, and the perpetrator specifically wanted to kill both of them. If they had only wanted to kill one of the victims, they would have had ample opportunities to do so without needing to enter their condo in the middle of the night. Surprisingly, none of the Stephensons' neighbors at the condo complex reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. The entrance had a key code and a front door with a lock, so Bill and Peggy would have needed to buzz in any visitors that showed up to see them, but unfortunately, the building did not have security cameras. There were no signs of forced entry, but the couple's unit had a concrete pad which was used as a back porch, and when investigators first arrived at the scene, the rear sliding door was open and its screen door was closed. If the Stephensons had left the sliding door unlocked, it's been theorized that the killer may have used it to enter the unit, and Bill and Peggy were ambushed in a surprise attack. Needless to say, everyone was left completely stunned by the murders, as the couple did not appear to have any known enemies with a motive to harm them in such a brutal fashion. The first angle that investigators explored was the Truckers' Chapel, as Bill's role there as chaplain minister allowed him to interact with a number of out-of-state truck drivers who were passing through the area. Peggy made it a rule that Bill was not allowed to invite any of these truckers back to their condo, but while Bill complied with this, the condo complex was located less than 4 miles away from the chapel, leading to speculation that a trucker could have followed Bill home. Indeed, it was reported that prior to the murders, a dark-haired man had shown up at the Truckers' Chapel and aggressively banged on the chapel doors while asking if anyone had seen Bill, but it's unclear if this man was ever identified. Regardless, Detective Cox would travel to over a dozen different states in order to track down and interview as many of the truck drivers as possible who had interacted with Bill. Well, less than 1 year later, there would be a potentially interesting development involving one of Bill's nephews, 58-year-old Charles Stephenson, who went by the nickname Stevie and lived just under 10 miles away in the town of Walton. On March the 29th, 2012, 67-year-old Lee Jennings was murdered inside the kitchen of her apartment in Aurora, Indiana, after she was beaten to death with an iron skillet and a pepper grinder. Less than 2 months later, Stevie was arrested for the crime, as it turned out that he had dated Lee and sometimes borrowed money from her. At the time of the murder, Stevie was facing a court-ordered deadline to repay a debt to his aunt, so in order to avoid facing possible criminal charges for missing it, Stevie killed Lee and stole $1,000 in cash from her to make the payment. Naturally, this crime made Stevie look like a compelling suspect in the murders of Bill and Peggy, but on August the 29th, the Boone County Sheriff's Office held a press conference to announce that DNA had been found at multiple locations at the Stephenson crime scene, and an analyst from the State Police Forensic Lab had finally put together a full DNA profile. Once again, no details have been released about where exactly this DNA was found, but Boone County Sheriff's Office spokesman Tom Shaban told the media, quote, "Where it was discovered, it only came from one person, and that person is the murderer," end quote. The authorities also confirmed that the DNA profile had been entered into the Combined DNA Index System, aka CODIS, but no match was made. Charles Stevie Stephenson was eventually convicted of Lee Jennings' murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole, but it turned out that the DNA profile from his aunt and uncle's murder scene did not match him, so he's no longer considered to be a serious suspect in this case. Detective Cox has also confirmed that he was able to track down and interview a number of truck drivers who frequented Bill's Truckers' Chapel, but he described them as all being very cooperative and willing to hand over samples of their DNA, and thus far, none of them have been a match to the DNA evidence in this case. In 2018, genetic genealogy started to become a major tool in solving cold cases, but the DNA profile in this case has not yet been entered into any genealogical databases like GEDmatch, and here is how Cox has explained it. Quote, "It has some complexity to it. Our DNA profile is not suitable for genealogy and/or phenotyping at this time. We hope that someday they will develop the technology to be able to do our complex profile." End quote. At the moment, all they can do is compare the DNA profile with the DNA of any potential suspects who pop up on the radar and rule them out if need be. In August of 2022, the case would be featured on an episode of the Unsolved Mysteries podcast titled The Condo Killings. Cox was interviewed during the episode, and even though he confirmed that the DNA profile only belongs to one person, he still thinks there's a good chance that at least two people were present at the crime scene, though whether both of them actively participated in the murders is unclear. The case continues to remain in active investigation, and many leads are still being pursued, but after nearly 15 years, there are still no conclusive answers about who was responsible for the murders of Bill and Peggy Stephenson. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So needless to say, even though this is a very intriguing case, it's a fairly difficult one to analyze due to the sheer amount of key information which has been intentionally withheld from the public and left everyone with more questions than answers. I definitely understand why law enforcement needs to keep certain details under wraps in order to verify the veracity of the information they receive, but at the same time, when the case remains unsolved for many years, you can understand the feelings of frustration as you start wondering if the release of more details might ring a bell with the right person and finally pave the way to that one big lead which breaks the case wide open. To be fair, the lead detective, Coy Cox, sounds genuinely passionate about solving this case since he knew the Stephenson family personally. In addition to the Unsolved Mysteries podcast, Cox has done interviews with a number of different media outlets and true crime podcasts such as Just the Tipsters and Catch My Killer, as he definitely thinks it's important to spread the word and get out as much information as he deems necessary without compromising the investigation. But I honestly can't think of another case I've covered in which there have been more vague, cryptic statements about the crime scene. We know that Bill and Peggy Stephenson were both murdered inside their condo in the middle of the night, with their bodies being found in different rooms, and their causes of death were blunt force trauma and sharp force trauma. And it's been repeatedly shared that the scene was intentionally staged, as in addition to posing the bodies, the perpetrator or perpetrators went to the trouble of moving items around throughout the condo and placing them in different rooms in what was an apparent attempt to send some sort of message. Detective Cox has not shared many specific details about this, only that it was unlike any other crime scene he has ever encountered, so this has definitely caused my imagination to run wild. Believe it or not, there was a time when this crime was actually being compared to the Delphi murders, which, as you probably know, involved 13-year-old Abigail Williams and 14-year-old Liberty German being murdered on February the 13th, 2017, near the Monon High Bridge Trail in Delphi, Indiana, a town which is about 200 miles northwest of Florence, Kentucky. The comparisons didn't really start being made until after a suspect named Richard Allen was arrested for the Delphi murders in October of 2022, as his defense team attempted to push forward the theory that the two girls were the victims of some sort of ritualistic sacrifice involving Odinism. Cox did a few interviews in which he said there were, quote-unquote, consistencies between the two crime scenes in the Delphi murders and the Stephenson murders, which briefly caused me to have a major WTF reaction, but Cox ultimately reached the conclusion that the two cases were probably not connected, and he does not believe that this crime was intended as some sort of ritual. And of course, Richard Allen was eventually convicted of the Delphi murders and sentenced to a combined total of 130 years in prison, and I seriously doubt he had anything to do with the Stephenson case. In addition to the Delphi murders, Cox has attempted to link this case to Samuel Little, a deceased serial killer who may have been responsible for somewhere between 60 and 93 murders during his lifetime in a number of different states. Cox found out that Little was arrested for a crime in Columbus, Ohio in April of 2011 before he was released 5 days later, and the next time he was picked up by police was in Louisville, Kentucky in June of that year. Well, Florence would have been just over halfway between Columbus and Louisville, and Little often traveled by hitchhiking and was technically free on the date that the Stephensons were murdered. But overall, Cox does not find it likely that Little was the culprit, as his known crimes had a much different MO, though Cox has not completely crossed him off his list of potential suspects. For a while, it seemed like the most logical suspect was Bill's nephew, Charles Stevie Stephenson, since he wound up being charged with the murder of Lee Jennings less than a year after this crime, but the DNA profile found at the Stephenson murder did not match him. While Stevie is no longer considered to be a suspect, I suppose you can't completely rule him out either, because even though there is only one DNA profile belonging to a killer, Cox does think it's possible that multiple people were present at the murder scene. But the murder of Lee Jennings was an incredibly messy crime in which Stevie left his DNA on the murder weapon, so I have my doubts that he could have been involved in the murders of his aunt and uncle without leaving some sort of incriminating evidence behind. On the surface, it might seem like too much of a coincidence that we would have two completely unrelated brutal home invasion murders involving the same family, which took place less than 1 year apart, but Bill was one of 14 siblings, and I'm sure he had a ton of nieces and nephews, so I suppose it wouldn't be too much of a stretch that one of them would turn out to be a bad seed. But even if Stevie wasn't the killer, it definitely seems like Bill and Peggy were murdered by someone they knew, and the crime was very personal. A recurring theme in a lot of these cases involving elderly couples, such as Russell and Shirley Dermond, is that the victims are often described as being the nicest people ever, and no one had a bad word to say about them. It sounds like this definitely applies to Bill and Peggy Stephenson, and while it's baffling enough that someone would decide to kill them in such a brutal fashion, this case is particularly perplexing since it sounds like the perpetrator or perpetrators remained inside the victim's condo for hours in order to stage some sort of scene. The one point that Detective Cox always reiterates during his interviews is that in the killer's eyes, both Bill and Peggy had to die. If they only had an issue with one of the victims, there would have been ample opportunities to murder them while they were alone, but they likely chose to enter the Stephensons' condo in the middle of the night because they specifically wanted to kill both of them and knew they would be there together. It's also possible that the killer had been to the condo on a prior occasion, which meant they were familiar enough with the layout to feel comfortable moving things around. Since a number of valuable items, including some cash, were left behind out in the open, it definitely appears that robbery was not the motive for the crime, but why was this couple targeted? Until more details are released, the big unanswered question I'll always have is, did the perpetrator stage the scene in a way that made sense to them? Or were they just trying to intentionally make things as confusing as possible in order to throw off the investigation and cover up the real motive for the crime? Cox described the scene as one that, quote-unquote, our perpetrator or perpetrators wanted us to find, which may very well be true, but the scene could also just be nothing more than one giant red herring. Well, no matter what the motive, it goes without saying that this was an incredibly brazen crime, since there was a risk of the perpetrator being seen or heard by the Stephensons' neighbors, but since the unit was located in the most secluded part of the complex, they did manage to pull it off, as nobody reported anything unusual. Since Bill ran his own trucker's chapel and offered spiritual services to a number of long-haul truck drivers who passed through the area, the most logical theory would seem to be that one of them may have murdered the Stephensons before taking off. After all, it's no big secret that a number of serial killers have turned out to be truck drivers, as their job allows them to travel around the country, and if they murder someone at a location they have no personal connection to, they can leave the area before they pop up on the radar as a potential suspect. Investigators have traveled to over a dozen different states in order to interview a number of truckers and collect samples of their DNA, and while all of them have been described as being cooperative and do not appear to be suspects, I have my doubts that they were able to track down every single trucker that Bill ever interacted with. For instance, We have reports of a man who was seen aggressively banging on the doors of the truckers' chapel and asking for Bill shortly before the murders, but it's unclear if this particular man was identified. It sounds like Peggy was well aware of the potential danger of Bill befriending so many strangers, which is why she made it a rule that he was not allowed to bring any of them home. But since the truckers' chapel was located less than 4 miles west of their condo complex, one theory which has been pushed forward is that a trucker could have followed Bill home and then, for reasons known only to themselves, decided to murder Bill and Peggy. I guess if there's a hole in that theory, is that while a stranger could have conceivably followed Bill to his condo without attracting attention, it probably would have been more difficult for someone to do so in a long-haul truck, particularly if they left it parked outside for several hours while they were inside the unit committing the murders and staging the scene. It's always been suspected that Bill and Peggy were murdered by someone they knew, but if investigators ever had suspicions about any specific friends, acquaintances, or other relatives besides Stevie Stephenson, they've never said so. Since the entrance to the condo complex had a key code and a lock, Bill and Peggy would have needed to buzz any visitors inside, and since it's believed they were the victims of a surprise attack, it would make sense if they invited someone they knew and trusted into the unit before they were ambushed. But the problem with that theory is that it's been reported that their time of death was sometime between 1 and 4 a.m., so would an elderly couple really invite someone into their condo at such a late hour? There were no signs of forced entry, and the front door was ajar when the bodies were discovered, but it's also been reported that the rear sliding door to the unit was open and the screen door closed when law enforcement first arrived at the scene. So if the Stephensons left the sliding door open or unlocked that night, then the killer may have used it to enter the unit and completely bypass the complex's front entrance. From the details I've heard, Bill and Peggy may have been murdered immediately after the perpetrator entered the unit, but they still decided to remain there for several more hours in order to stage the scene. I've already mentioned that a number of valuable items were left untouched, but I noticed that law enforcement has never specifically stated that nothing was stolen from the condo, so I'd be curious to know if they were able to determine if anything was missing. One detail shared by Detective Cox, which I've always been particularly intrigued by, is a statement that some of the photos inside the condo were arranged to suggest that the killer liked certain people and disliked others. You can interpret this statement in a number of different ways, but while Cox is obviously not disclosed who was featured in those photos, it suggests that the killer was not just familiar with Bill and Peggy, but people from their personal life. I'd be curious to know if investigators have shared more details with any of the people in these photos, because if the killer did something to imply that they were threatening their lives, I'm sure law enforcement would be obliged to let them know. And I also wonder if any of the individuals in the photos were able to offer much insight into the whole situation. The key piece of evidence which could potentially lead to this case being solved is the DNA profile found at the scene, but after nearly 15 years, it is yet to be matched to anyone. If the Stephensons often invited people inside their condo, you're likely going to find a lot of DNA in there, but investigators have confirmed that this particular DNA was found in specific spots, which indicated it could only belong to the murderer. We know that the DNA profile has been entered into CODIS and has not yet been matched to anyone, so the offender has obviously not been arrested for any other serious crimes. Genetic genealogy had not yet been put into practice when the profile was originally created, but the profile has been described as being too complex for the purposes of genealogy and phenotyping, which is why these processes have still not been used. I'm not entirely sure what they mean about the profile being too complex, as we note that it has been used to exclude a number of people from being the perpetrator, but at the moment, it sounds like entering it into a genealogical database and potentially linking the DNA to a genetic relative just isn't an option right now, though this could happen in the future if there are enough advances in technology. Until then, investigators will have to identify a potential suspect before they can use the DNA profile to rule them in or out. And if there was really more than one perpetrator involved in these murders, then this does increase the chances of someone talking and the case being solved someday. Unfortunately, with the limited information that has been released publicly, there really isn't all that much more I can say about this case, and since so many details were withheld, it's very difficult to formulate a theory about who the killer was or what their motive could have been. All I know is that the crime has been built up in such a way that it sounds like it may be unlike any other documented homicide scene in recorded history. It's always horrible when someone becomes the victim of a murder like this, but it's particularly tragic and baffling when it involves an elderly couple who were married for over 55 years, had a large loving family and circle of friends, and were universally beloved by everyone who knew them. Bill and Peggy were such generous people that this crime will be doubly tragic if it turned out that the perpetrator was someone that Bill helped during his time at the Truckers' Chapel, and this person took advantage of the situation. Out of all the cases I've covered on the podcast, this is one in which I'm particularly anxious to learn the details which have not been released to the public, so hopefully we get a resolution someday and finally learn the full story. So if you happen to have any information about the murders of Bill and Peggy Stephenson, please contact the Boone County Sheriff's Office at 859-334-8496. That's 859-334-8496. So now let's move on to our next case. Our second story also begins in 2011, this time in Norwalk, Iowa, which is located in Warren County and is part of the Des Moines metropolitan area and had a population of around 9,000 at that time. Our next two victims are 79-year-old James William Wood, who goes by the name Bill, and his 72-year-old wife, Kadena Lozelle Wood, who goes by the name Kay. Bill has been married on 2 previous occasions and has a total of 7 children, as well as 2 stepchildren from his second wife, Marilyn, who passed away in 2006, and he also has a total of 21 grandchildren, 21 great-grandchildren, and 2 great-great-grandchildren. Kay is a widow who has 6 children of her own, but since she happened to be the best friend of one of Bill's sisters, she wound up starting a relationship with them before they got married. At this particular point, Bill and Kay have just recently celebrated their 3-year wedding anniversary, and the couple have been described as being deeply in love and were often seen holding hands like a couple teenagers. Bill is a retired ironworker, but in spite of his advanced age, he has spent the past quarter-century working in Des Moines as a part-time delivery driver for J.W. Perry Incorporated, a wholesale florist and greenery supplier. The Woods live in a manufactured trailer-type home in a rural area on U.S. Route 63 just south of Des Moines International Airport, and since Bill is just 1 week shy of his 80th birthday, his friends and family have planned a surprise birthday party for him. However, at around 11:35 p.m. on the evening of Saturday, July the 30th, the fire department responded to a 911 call about a fire at the Wood residence, but even though they were located just down the road a short distance away, the home was already engulfed in flames by the time they arrived, and it was too hot for anyone to attempt to go inside. The firefighters were forced to spend the next several hours extinguishing the blaze, and by the morning of July the 31st, the residence had completely burned to the ground. A search was performed at the scene, and at around 11:30 a.m., a charred body was discovered in the rubble. The victim was presumably Bill or Kay, but they were burned so badly that their gender cannot even initially be determined, so the body was transported to the office of the state medical examiner. But curiously, there was no trace of a second body at the scene, and the couple's pickup truck, a red 2009 Chevrolet Silverado with Iowa license plate number 426 SOC, was missing from the garage. While the authorities used the OnStar Vehicle Communications Company to track down the pickup truck, and that very same morning, it was discovered abandoned in the parking lot of the Cordillera Ranch Apartments, a high-income apartment complex located on North Donnelly Avenue in Kansas City, Missouri, about 170 miles southwest of the Wood residence. According to everyone who knew Bill and Kay, neither of them had any connection to this area, so the truck was impounded and processed. There have been conflicting reports from different sources about whether or not anything of evidentiary value was found inside the truck, but investigators have declined to publicly disclose any details. A number of witnesses also reported having seen an unidentified white male near the truck at the apartment complex. He was described as being between 40 and 60 years old with a white or gray crew cut, and his height was somewhere between 6'2" and 6'6". Investigators confirmed that based on the information they received from the witnesses, the man was not just some innocent bystander who happened to walk by the truck after it was already abandoned, as they felt he was connected to it. A composite sketch was created and circulated for the man, and law enforcement referred to him as a person of interest. Even though only one body was found in the rubble at the Wood residence, and it could not initially be determined if the victim was Bill or Kay, their family, friends, and a number of volunteers organized a massive search effort for them and circulated and posted a number of missing persons flyers throughout the community. It would not be until 3 weeks later, on August the 19th, when the Iowa Department of Public Safety publicly announced that DNA testing had positively identified the charred body as belonging to Bill, and an autopsy determined that he died of multiple gunshot wounds. A press release initially reported that Bill had been shot multiple times in the head, but the authorities quickly withdrew this statement and confirmed that they were declining to disclose where exactly Bill had been shot. They have also not revealed what type of firearm was used to shoot Bill, or any details about an accelerant which may have been used to burn down the Woods residence, though it was apparent that arson had taken place. The Warren County Sheriff's Office and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation would launch a homicide investigation, as well as a missing persons investigation for Kay, who had still not been found. The authorities have never considered Kay to be a suspect in the death of her husband, as it seemed likely that she was a victim that may have been taken from the scene by an unknown third party who stole the couple's pickup truck and abandoned it. Bill was laid to rest at Webb Cemetery in Norwalk, but since Kay had not been officially confirmed to be dead, his obituary listed her name among, quote-unquote, those left to cherish his memory. The crime left everyone completely perplexed, since the Woods were not known for having enemies and were well liked by everyone who knew them. Andrew Knott, the general manager at Bill's employer, J.W. Perry Incorporated, told the press, quote, "He's a saint, a nicer guy you'd never find," end quote. One of Kay's grandsons, Brad Harris, also made this statement, quote, "Kay and William were the most loved people. It's unimaginable that someone would harm them. They are two of the nicest people on the planet," end quote. While the Woods residence was located in a rural area, they did have some neighbors who lived nearby, but it does not sound like any of them reported seeing or hearing anything unusual until the fire started. In terms of potential motive, it turned out that on the morning of July the 30th, several hours before the fire took place, Bill and Kay had traveled over 40 miles to the small town of Stewart in order to attend an antiques auction. Bill was known for collecting classic cars, as he owned a Model A Ford that he drove in parades, and he kept a 1940s gas pump in his front yard, and Kay loved collecting China dolls, and the couple kept expensive antiques at their residence. It's been reported that the couple did purchase something at the auction, but no specific details have been released. At one point, Brad Harris told the press that he heard someone mention that Bill and Kay may have bought a brass urn, but he confirmed, quote, "I'm assuming whatever they bought is missing because we don't have them. Unless they were in the truck. We don't have the truck," end quote. All investigators would confirm is that since the Wood residence burned completely to the ground, it was difficult to determine if anything was stolen. Unfortunately, the investigation would reach a standstill, and in July of 2016, a 5-year anniversary article was published in which the authorities confirmed that they had looked into hundreds of leads, but had yet to find a resolution. However, they did express their belief that the Woods were likely harmed by someone who personally knew them. As far as I can tell, there have not been any developments in the case in quite some time, so after nearly 15 years, Kay Wood is still a missing person, and there are no conclusive answers about who is responsible for the murder of Bill Wood. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So throughout the course of this episode, I frequently made reference to the 2014 murders of Russell and Shirley Dermond, and another parallel you can make between that case and this one is that while Russell was murdered inside their home, Shirley was initially discovered to be missing until her body was eventually found weighed down in a lake behind the residence. To this day, no one has been able to figure out why the perpetrator did this, and the same logic applies to what happened to Bill and Kay Wood, as Bill was murdered at the residence, but Kay was not at the scene, and if she was murdered at another location, she has still never been found. You can also draw parallels between this crime and another case which was featured on the Unsolved Mysteries podcast, as well as an episode of The Trail Went Cold earlier this year, and that's the 2012 deaths of Bubba and Molly McLaren, another elderly couple who were found dead when their farmhouse in rural Tennessee burned to the ground. The big twist in that case is that two of the couple's grandchildren, Chloe Leverett and Gage Daniel, had been living there at the time, but could not be found at the scene, and they are still officially considered to be missing. The key difference is that it's still never been conclusively determined whether any arson or foul play took place, as it's possible the fire was nothing more than a tragic accident, and it burned so hot that the children's remains were completely reduced to ash and were overlooked during the search effort. However, there is no such ambiguity in this case, as Bill Wood was shot multiple times, so he was clearly the victim of a homicide, and the fire was likely started by his killer. It is interesting how law enforcement has never addressed the possibility that Kay could have also been murdered at the residence, and her body was just completely burned down to nothing after the fire started, which would explain why she was not found at the scene. After all, Bill's body was burned so badly that they couldn't even initially determine his gender, and it took a few weeks to identify him via DNA testing. But there's a major difference between a fire completely consuming the bodies of two small children rather than an adult woman, so I think the authorities are operating under the assumption that if Kay had burned in the fire, they would have at least found something. Another possibility that doesn't seem very likely is Kay having murdered Bill herself before fleeing the scene. While I suppose that's not completely impossible, Kay was a 72-year-old woman who was, by all accounts, head over heels in love with Bill, had close relationships with her children and grandchildren, had no real personal problems, and was described as one of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet. In addition to the lack of any apparent motive, law enforcement has never indicated that they've uncovered any evidence these past 15 years to suggest that Kay might still be alive somewhere, and it also doesn't make sense for her to drive her pickup truck to Kansas City, an area she had no known connection to, and then abandon it. And obviously, witnesses saw an unidentified middle-aged man in the vicinity of the truck, and it does not appear there were any reported sightings of Kay there, so it seems very likely that this guy drove the truck to that location. But of course, this only adds to the bizarreness of the crime, as you have to ask why the perpetrator would have gone to the trouble of burning down the house to cover up what they did to Bill and then taken Kay away from the scene. Perhaps they were trying to give off the false impression that Kay murdered Bill and started the fire and ran away on her own, but much like when Shirley Dermond disappeared after her husband was killed, nobody really believed that these elderly missing women were the perpetrators. So obviously, one of the biggest obstacles preventing me from being able to put together a full-fledged feature-length episode about this case is that, much like the murders of Bill and Peggy Stephenson, law enforcement has withheld a lot of information from the public. And if they manage to turn up any promising leads or developments these past 15 years, they've never openly said so. Well, if you go to the website iowacoldcases.org, you'll find a profile page for this case, which contains a number of comments from Bill and Kay's various children and grandchildren who have expressed their unhappiness and frustration with the lack of progress in the investigation, as well as the lack of communication from law enforcement, since it appears that the victims' families don't have a much better idea of where this case stands than the general public. While investigators may have their own reasons for being so secretive, I'm sure this doesn't offer much comfort for Bill and Kay's loved ones if they have no idea if there's much chance of the case being solved. It's particularly tough for Kay's family because at least Bill's family had a body they could bury, whereas Kay is still missing, and while the chances of her still being alive after all this time are very slim, the hardest part is not knowing. Much like Bill and Peggy Stephenson, everyone seemed to love Bill and Kay Wood and did not have a bad word to say about them, so it once again begs the question of why someone would feel compelled to murder a harmless elderly couple in such a brutal fashion. The Woods were not wealthy, but they did like to collect antiques, and since they attended an antiques auction on the morning the fire took place, the most prominent theory is that they may have been targeted by someone who was there and then became the victims of a robbery. Since the residence was completely burned to the ground, it's unclear if investigators were able to determine if anything was stolen, but there are a number of holes in the theory that the auction played a role in the crime. It's been speculated that the perpetrator could have seen the woods at the auction, and they possibly drew this person's attention if they purchased something expensive, though it's not entirely clear what they bought. The perpetrator then formulated a plan to rob the woods and followed them home, but the issue is that the auction took place in the town of Stuart, which is 40 miles away from Norwalk, and while I don't know the exact time that Bill and Kay returned to the residence, it presumably would have been during the early morning or early to mid-afternoon, and the fire did not take place until around 11:30 p.m. It sounds like there is a long window of time that day in which Bill and Kay's whereabouts are unaccounted for, but if they were followed all the way from Stuart, I suppose it's possible that the killer could have entered the residence and held the couple captive for several hours before they started the fire. However, another big hole in this theory is that if the woods were followed home, the perpetrator would have obviously needed their own vehicle, yet the couple's pickup truck was missing. So the only way this plan would work is if multiple people were involved in order to drive both the original vehicle and the pickup truck away from the scene, but you certainly can't discount that possibility. While the Wood residence was in a rural area, it was not in the middle of nowhere, as it was just south of Des Moines International Airport and next to a well-traveled highway, so if the perpetrator did not follow the couple from the auction, they still could have traveled to the residence from somewhere on foot and then drove away in the truck. But if so, why did they drive 170 miles to Kansas City? The whole deal with the truck is yet another major head-scratcher in this case, because if the perpetrator lived in Kansas City or had ties to the area, why would they target a couple from Norwalk, Iowa? If they lived in Iowa, what made them travel this distance to Kansas City, and how did they make it back home? While law enforcement has been very tight-lipped about many aspects of this investigation, they have expressed their belief that the Woods were likely harmed by someone they knew rather than a random stranger, though I have no idea if it's just their personal opinion or if they have specific information which points in that direction. But once again, Bill and Kay were not known to have any ties to Kansas City or the location where the truck was abandoned, so why did their truck wind up there? It would be one thing if the truck was left in a rough neighborhood which was rampant with crime, but the Cordillera Ranch Apartments is known for being a rather high-income apartment complex in a nice area, so was it just chosen at random, or was there any significance to this spot? I would like to think that investigators interviewed all of the residents of this complex to see if they had any connection to the Woods, but if they turned up any information of value, they've never said so. But let's look at the timeline on the night of the crime. Even though the Woods had neighbors who lived fairly close by, it does not sound like they recalled hearing any gunshots or anything out of the ordinary before the fire started, and the official call to 911 took place at 11:35. Since the fire department was located just down the road, it didn't take them long to arrive at the Wood residence, but by this point, the fire was already burning so hot that it took them hours to put it out. So I wonder if this means that the fire started a lot earlier than 11:35, and it just took the neighbors a long time to notice. I know that investigators haven't shared much about the circumstances of the fire, so I have no idea what kind of accelerant, if any, was used. It takes approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes to drive from Norwalk to Kansas City, and while we don't know the exact time the pickup truck was abandoned in the apartment complex parking lot, it was found later that same morning. While law enforcement was able to use OnStar to track down the truck to that location, they have not revealed if OnStar allowed them to track all of the truck's movements between when it left Norwalk and arrived in Kansas City. If Kay was abducted from the scene by someone who murdered her at another location and disposed of her body, being able to track all of the truck's movements could provide an idea of where her remains might be. So, presuming that Kay was not directly involved in Bill's murder, why was she taken away from the scene to begin with? We have no idea if Kay was still alive at the time or was also killed inside the house, but one possibility is that the perpetrator was hoping to frame Kay and fool the authorities into believing that she killed Bill and started the fire before she went on the run. Or the most disturbing possibility is that they wanted to sexually assault her and decided to do so at another location before they killed her. There is conflicting information about whether or not anything of evidentiary value was found inside the abandoned truck, but either way, law enforcement has not confirmed or denied this. Obviously, if hair, fingerprints, or DNA belonging to Kay was found inside the truck, that wouldn't mean much since she would have used the truck all the time, but I'd be curious to know if there were traces of blood or other physical evidence which pointed towards her becoming the victim of foul play. Whatever the case, unlike the Stephenson murders, investigators have never mentioned finding a DNA profile belonging to the perpetrator. The most promising lead are the sightings of an unidentified middle-aged man that was seen in the vicinity of the pickup truck at the apartment complex, and while we don't know the exact time when these sightings took place, and details are purposely vague, investigators have confirmed that the sightings point towards this man having a connection to the truck, and he was not just some random bystander who happened to walk past it. This is why the man is considered to be a person of interest, but if you've seen his composite sketch, there's nothing particularly distinctive about him, as he just looks like your standard middle-aged white male. And if he has a resemblance to anyone that the Woods personally knew, no one has ever said so. Overall, much like the Stephenson case, with the information we have right now, it's difficult to formulate a concrete theory about what may have happened here. The circumstances of this crime make it sound a lot more personal than a robbery, but given that the Woods were a universally beloved couple with no known enemies, why would anyone have decided to target them? Alternatively, I suppose it's possible that Bill and Kay were targeted completely at random by someone who was just passing through the area and, for reasons known only to them, decided to murder an elderly couple. It sounds like it has been pure hell for their respective families to not know why this crime took place, and for Kay's loved ones to still not know her whereabouts. It sounds like they are quite frustrated by the lack of communication from law enforcement, but do they have their own ideas about what happened and are being secretive about it in order to protect the integrity of the investigation? Or are they just as perplexed as the rest of us? Whatever the case, this was a pretty horrific and senseless crime, and the victims' families deserve answers. So if you happen to have any information on the murder of Bill Wood or the disappearance of Kay Wood, please contact the Warren County Sheriff's Office at 515-961-1122. That's 515-961-1122. Or you can also contact the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation at 641-342-6263. That's 641-342-6263. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 8 years, our Patreon page has released over 90 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about 2 crimes from Texas which were featured on Unsolved Mysteries: the 1994 murder of Joan Jeffries and the 1995 murder of David Merrifield. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Pathwind Chili, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss another case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1977 murder of T.K. Hardy. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 80 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I just want to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week, and be sure to join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.